Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest Scots Whay Hae podcast. And today I'm so pleased to be joined by writer and broadcaster Billy Kay to talk about his memoir, Born in Kyle, a love letter to an Ayrshire childhood, that I'm sure we'll touch upon so much more. Hello, Billy.
How you doing?
I'm really well. And I must say, for the people watching on video, this is the book here, and I've enjoyed it so much. There's so much to get stuck into. But before we do that, people will perhaps know you best from your books such as Scots, The Mother Tongue, and your broadcast. You've got a distinctive voice. But before we talk about Born in Kyle, can you tell us a bit about your work? How would you describe what you've done over the years?
I would describe it as being from a working class background. Literally, I drank Scottish culture and Scottish identity in with my mother's milk. It was common for me to hear, we're going to talk about some Scots saws that are in the book, Scots expressions. And one that I grew up with was, if you've got a good Scots tongue in your head, you're fit to go over the world. In other words, be confident in what you are because you're a Scots speaker and you're Scottish. And I've travelled the world thinking that way, and it was true. I get 99% positivity because I was Scottish. So, but within the growing up that I had, the education that I had, the media that I had, there was a lot of negativity towards Scottish culture and Scottish identity. Sure. And it was kind of pigeonholed, or it was turned into something. There was a caricature of it. So what I tried to do when I started broadcasting was fill the huge gaps that there were, where working class, especially Scottish people, had very little of their culture celebrated in the media. So my first series that I made as a producer was Odyssey, which was working class oral history, recorded and then written down into books. So I would say that's been the kind of crusading zeal for an Ayrshire Covenanting background that I've had, is to tell people what they missed out on, because I was, unlike most of them, I was able to go to university.
Yeah.
And because I was good at languages, I was able to go to university and educate myself in, like yourself, in Scottish literature. And once you've got that education, once you realise what's there, then I think it gives you a crusading zeal to make sure that everybody, especially everybody who's Scottish, should know about that. So, I mean, it started off with working class history, then extended into ethnic history, if you like, fascinated by the different ethnic groups that came to Scotland for the Odyssey programmes. And then it involved going out into the world and tracing the Scottish diaspora in the series that I made for the BBC and in the book, The Scottish World.
Yeah.
So it's all about giving people a wider range of Scottish culture than most of them got, certainly in their education and definitely in their media. So that's been the kind of background to it all, I would say.
Yeah, and I've found that the more that you learn, the more you want to know. It leads on to, because
Yes.
you're never going to know it all.
Yes.
It's really interesting. A couple of things there. This is almost at the end of the book rather than the beginning, but you talk about going abroad and the reception that you get there. It can kind of be very different to the discussion at home.
Well, again, not in my home, because my parents brought me up to be proud of being Scottish. And from a literary point of view, for example, the poetry and the songs of Burns were literally part of this popular culture that I grew up in. So there was that. And because my parents were readers, mostly for the library rather than for books in the house, but for example, one of the favourite books was The House of the Green Shutters, George Douglas Brown. And that was set in Ayrshire.
Yeah.
It was set in Ochiltree, just down the road. I can't folk for Ochiltree. I later discovered that Douglas Brown, I believe he was an illegitimate Wayne,
Right.
And the father was a Goston farmer. He just outside Goston, where I came from. So, and he was against the Kailyard. He was against the romanticisation of Scottish working class culture. And I loved that novel. I just thought it was brilliant, and I identified a lot with it. So from my own home background, I got pride and I got Scottish culture. But from the television, from the media, it was either one stereotype or another, none of which tied in with my broader view of who we were and where we came from and what we could achieve in the world.
So people understand, what kind of time period are we talking?
Well, I was born in 1951. So my childhood was in a Scottish village rather than a global village. It was not, we didn't get television until I was about 11, I would guess. And I can tell that because the famous game at Hampden between Real Madrid and Eintracht Frankfurt, I had to go to a neighbour's house to watch that. I went to the Carruthers family up the road to watch that, and that was a thing. The few people that had televisions then would accept other folk into their house to see big events like that. Whereas by the time Scotland beat England, I think it was 2-1 at Wembley, which should be 62 or 63, we had a television. And Provost Joan Murray, who didn't have a television, came and watched that game in our house. So the first 10 years were solid Scots-speaking environment with no English coming into the house every day in life, because the radio was there, the wireless was there, and my dad listened to the news, and there was Scots comic programs like the McFlannels that they listened to on radio, but there was very little celebration of Scottish culture that was part of the media at that point. I think I mentioned in Born in Cayon that I've only one memory of something being positive about Scotland and Scottish culture. This is beyond football.
Yes.
And it was a programme that Jimmy Logan was in,
where
there was a newborn bairn. And Jimmy, the character, made a wee toast saying how blessed this bairn was to be born Scottish. And it wasn't a vainglorious thing. It wasn't a here to us was like us. It was just a gentle statement of belonging and us belonging to one another and who get that with. And that tied in with my vision of what I was brought up with.
Yeah.
I remember, for example, when I started working in broadcasting and I made radio and then television programs on Scottish culture. And I remember somebody gave one of them a bad review. And my parents were astonished that anybody Scottish could write that about this programme. Right. Because it was ours. It was our culture. How could somebody who was Scottish say that about this programme? So that was the kind of positive, maybe a wee bit naive background I came from, but very positive towards Scottish culture.
In the time that you've been working, at points have you felt like a kind of almost a lone public voice talking about Scots as a language? I mean, it's maybe changed today, but there were periods it felt like that, I think, to me, that, there was Billy Kay and not many others. Yes, academically, people were looking at it, but
in the public domain, I think me coming out for Scots was the equivalent of a Japanese officer committing harakiri in public, as far as my broadcasting career was concerned. So, yes, but I couldn't have done anything else because I was for that background.
Yeah.
I couldn't have written Born in Kyle in anything but Scots because that was the language that was the language of that culture in that period, the 50s and 60s, and how rich it was. I mean, as I've proved by the writing of the book. So, at the same time, I was lucky enough to learn. I studied French and German at university. I did higher Russian at Kilmarnock Academy. And it was that linguistic range that also gave me the confidence in my own mother tongue and the realization that there was no need to ditch that to go on in life, that as long as you were a fluent English speaker, French and German speaker, eventually Portuguese speaker through my wife, and I had some Russian and I learned a wee bit Gaelic, then it was daft to ditch your own mother tongue to go on in the universe, which was the kind of classical colonised mentality in Scotland, where, oh son, you have to go on, you have to ditch who you are, where you come from, and what you spoke at home. And that is just not true, because if you're brought up bilingual with 12 leids, it's a hell of a lot easier to become multilingual with several languages. So this is why, and I can't help it. But at the same time, they educated me. I did Scottish literature and Scots language at university, and boy, that crusading zeal that I had to tell folk was multiplied when I realised that the language I spoke at home, spoken by my grandfathers and mother and father, that they had a culture and they had a language with a pedigree going back 1,000 years. It just gives you a totally different perspective on life.
We'll go back and touch about language again later, and perhaps the pressures to ditch it, as you say, because at the time there were external pressures. But for writing Born and Kyle, were there inspirations behind it? But, the type of book you were going to write?
It was written at the time of the lockdown.
Right.
Where things were suspended. I couldn't go and interview folk and make radio documentaries. Although I did manage today, one of my last series was on Scots in the Low Countries, where I literally managed to dodge into Belgium and Holland at a time when the borders weren't closed for COVID. But it was a period where I realised I had time. And what I did was I recorded the audiobook of Scots a Mother Tongue in that period in my house. And then I had the project of showing people that the language in the mother tongue was a living language, still with a great vocabulary and being able to communicate a way of looking at the world. So I determined to record my memoirs of my childhood growing up, and add to that some creative writing, some poetry and some short stories that I'd written over the years that were set in the same cultural background. And also I recorded the whole thing as an audiobook as well. So they're both on Audible. And that's been good, because there are old Scots learners in the world nowadays, which there weren't when I started out, people who want to learn Scots. And when you've got it on Kindle and can hear it on Audible, then they're able to learn and how it's pronounced, not just to read it as a foreign language.
I think perhaps in part due to there's some fantastic black and white photographs in the book as well. It put me, certainly the early years, put me a little bit in mind of the Bill Douglas trilogy, My Childhood, as well. Fantastic films. Younger than you, definitely, but there's still that feel to them of a different world.
A different world entirely. And looking back on it, how different it was. I mean, there's one story of my great aunt Rosie, and her husband, Pen Clark. I'll just tell the story practically as I do it in the book. They stayed in a street leading to the main road in Goston when they were all full. And New Year, the tradition was to have steak pie and a big pot of mushy peas. And in our house, the mushy peas with a ham bane were made for Hogmanay, so that revellers coming to our house for Hogmanay in the wee small hours got a plate of mushy peas. Anyway, Ken and Rosie had made this big pot of mushy peas, and they'd had their steak pie, they'd given out to visitors, but they had tons left.
Right.
And Rosie says, I want to throw out the peas. And Ken says, don't be daft. A wee boy would love to have a plate of them. And Rosie says, okay. So he looked out the window, waiting for a wee boy to pass by. And a wee boy passed by, and Ken chapped the window and said, here, son, would you like a plate of mushy peas? And the wee boy says, aye. The wee boy come in. He was given a plate of mushy peas with some vinegar on it. And he said to Ten, you haven't got a wee cup of tea to this, have you? And a cup of tea was produced. And he had his mushy peas. They loved them. And then he said, have you got a wee biscuit for the cup of tea? And Ten loved this. And the wee boy went back out in the street, and the twa generations had communicated, and they'd both had a great time. Now, the day Uncle Ten would probably be arrested for inviting a wee boy into his house. And what a different world that was. But that was the way it was. Literally, I tell the story as well of only Wayne could be commandeered at any time going by an old buddy's house to run messages for them.
Yeah.
So just a didn't thing.
Yeah.
So I'm heading for fit by the public park, and an old dear down the road in Loudon Avenue, come here, son, would you run and get some ham for my man's tea? And that I couldn't refuse that.
Yeah.
Because I was spared to a community, and that would have got back to my mum and dad that I hadn't helped an old buddy. So a different world entirely.
And different levels of trust there. You know,
Aye.
he's got to trust you're not running with the money. You've got to trust that it's all above board.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm really interested in education, because education is key to a lot of this.
Mm.
What was your education like, both in and out of the classroom?
In the classroom, literally, you got the belt or a ruler over your knuckles, even for a very early age.
Yeah.
If you got things wrong, which looking back was guy wrong that happened, but it was just that's the way it was. Because I was able to adapt, and I was good at languages, and I adapted to English. I didn't have maybe problems that some folk did. But I adapted and I got on. And I had good teachers who taught me history and some literature, etc., etc. So I had a decent education in Galston. But I was also, as I say, my parents brought me up with a strong Scottish identity. And, for example, I mean, in the frontispiece of the book, I've got something that I learned later on, which is a quote from John Barber's epic, The Bruce, from the 14th and 15th century, where he says, the king lay into Gollistune that is richt even anent Loudon. The king stayed in Galston. This was before the Battle of Loudon Hill in 1307. It was a pivotal battle. Now, I didn't know about the Bruce quote, but my dad took me to Loudon Castle and to the Bar Castle and told me that Bruce had been imprisoned in the Bar Castle and had got out of there. My granny stayed in Standalane Street in Goston. And Standalane comes from a legend about William Wallace, where his men were aware that a bigger English force were coming to get him, and some of them were supposed to have run away. And Wallace's legend has it that Wallace said, I stond alane. So Standalane Street became the name of the street where this is supposed to have happened. So I grew up with these stories, with legends and myths. And another one was that William Wallace went girdling for trout in the river, in the Irvine Water. And I went for a duke in the Irvine Water. So I belonged to a distinctive culture and a distinctive place that had a distinctive language.
Yeah. But I guess at home it sounds like there was no push not to speak Scots. It was quite open and welcome and used.
Yes.
But that wasn't the case in everyone's home. I know my mother, who's from Annan down in Dumfriesshire, if she wanted to wind up her own mother, she would use some local words, local Scots, and that would,
Aye,
oh, you know, you're not supposed to speak like
I
that.
know, I know. It's tragic. I mean, it's tragic, the cultural brainwashing that a lot of generations of Scots had. Eh, and as I get out of Galston, out of Blaweary and into the world, later on in life, I experienced a lot of that, especially in cities
Mm.
where the local dialect, patois, was regarded as coarse, and you shouldn't be talking like that. I never had that at all, I'm pleased to
Yeah.
say. We had Burns. We had a world-class author from our culture who spoke our language, and, his songs were sung around the world.
Yeah, and the confusion that kind of forcing people to speak and write in one way at school and actually the way people were speaking around them, it'd be confusing for a child. It makes me think of the James Kelman novel, Kieran Smith Boy, where at home his mum's telling him off, oh, you must speak like this, you must speak the Queen's English. Meanwhile, his dad's watching the boxing and it's a completely different language.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a problem in Scottish culture, I think.
It definitely was, and it's written about by novels like From Scenes Like These by Gordon Williamson. He's
Yeah.
got a passage about that, about the tension between the two languages. The famous one that I love to quote of Sunset Song, two Chris's there were that held her heart and tormented her. One minute you were English, sharp and clean and true, and the next minute you were Scots. And it was a beautiful, beautiful passage. So that awareness of that dichotomy, that antisyzygy, that pulling of people in different directions, yeah, I was aware of that later on in life, but fortunately, I didn't get any of that in my own background.
You mentioned antisyzygy, and it's a word that folk who've studied Scottish literature and culture will know, but some people won't. Could you just break down that idea for Scottish antisyzygy? I always thought if you got that in Scrabble, you'd be walking away a winner. But it's
I,
an interesting idea.
well, I understand it as the pulling in opposite directions. That you can be proudly Scottish in one way, at the same time you can be deeply ashamed of being Scottish, and you can have a cultural cringe in another way. Uh, and McDermott is often associated with him. He was very much on my side, if you like, in that he despised the cringe, and he loved to have a go at the cringe. And
Yeah.
he's got these great two-liners like a Scottish poet mun assume the burden of his people's doom and dee to brack their leaving tomb. Wonderful, wonderful stuff. So that's my kind of way of looking at the antisyzygy. And I feel that the people who suffer from the cringe are basically just pear sour that need to be educated.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of putting it. Public perception of Scots language and culture at the time, you're, discovering it and kind of being taught about
Mm-hmm.
it, was you talk a little bit about what was on television, the White Heather Club and
Mm-hmm.
various things that, were just so they were so strange from most people's lives.
Yes, yes. And the alternative to that was the Glasgow Hard Man, which was another character, more based on reality perhaps, but exaggerated, so that one of the few Scottish types he came across was the Glasgow Hard Man, in depictions of urban life.
Yeah, absolutely. That kind of Clydesidism that
Mm-hmm.
happened around about that time. The literary legacy you've touched on a little bit of Ayrshire is quite incredible. Burns, of course, we know.
Yeah.
But you've mentioned House of the Green Shutters. You've kind of alluded to John Galt, who when I first read Annals of the Parish, it's it's Kailyard, isn't it? It's kind of having a go at Kailyard. For people who don't know Kailyard, the cabbage patch, the kind of Couthie, if you like, a
Mm-hmm.
very certain way of looking at Scottish culture from your
Yeah.
part of the world. Can you
Mm-hmm.
talk a little bit about John Galt and that side of things?
And and up to Janice Galloway
Yeah.
and Willie McIlvany and Liam McIlvany and people in the present day. No, there's a rich literary tradition there. Galt, I love the novels, the Provost, and his use of Scots is fantastic.
Yeah.
John Galt. One of my favourite images that I kept from Galt, and it's from the Annals of the Parish. And a hobby of mine is wine, and I wrote the book Knee Deep in Claret with Callan MacLean on the history of wine in Scotland. And in there, there's a quote from Galt where the temperance movement got strong in Scotland at the very end of the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th century. And one of the two drinks come into Scottish culture and replaced the wine drinking and the ale drinking tradition to a certain extent. And one was whiskey come in from the north, from the Highlands, but the other one was tea come in from the British Empire. And tea, I describe it as, was regarded as a bit dangerous, a bit like cannabis resin. When I was at Edinburgh University in the 1970s. And there's a great description by Galt of some ladies brewing up an illicit cup of tea with an illicit some kind of burner of us with a fire, but in a field behind a hedge somewhere near Dulmailing in rural Ayrshire. And they're hiding the fact that they're drinking tea because it would be looked down upon at that time as something foreign and dangerous. And the Reverend, is it the Reverend Balquhidder?
Yes.
Finds these women doing that, and they practically run out the way so that they're not caught drinking tea. And it's a very funny image.
They're very funny books. He's really comic. If people don't know John Galt, they should really check it out. And you've mentioned people continuing up to Janice Galloway, Andrew O'Hagan. That's fantastic. There's some lovely surprises in the book, at least surprises to me. I didn't know about the Edgar Allan Poe connection in Ayrshire. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I made a program about it. And well, his name was Edgar Allan Poe, and the Allans were an Irvine merchant family. And when young Edgar was brought over to Irvine, it may have been for as little as about 7 or 8 months. He may have been back and forward a few times because his family also lived in England briefly at that time. So it may have been longer than 7 months. It may have been off and on over a period of 2 years. But it coincided with the tradition of body snatching for the medical schools in Glasgow, in the case of Irvine, or in Edinburgh, where Scottish medical schools were becoming world famous.
Yeah.
And students from all over the world were studying there, and they needed cadavers. So, a market opened up, and Irvine, there was a group of body snatchers. I think you can even tell the house that they stayed in, where they were based at that time. So young Edgar Allan Poe, his school was the other side of the old kirk in Irvine, the school he went to. So over the wall from this kirk, there were armed guards protecting newly buried bodies from the body snatchers. There were great stories of people being accidentally interred and having a bell attached to their thumb so that they could ring the bell if they were accidental. So Edgar Allan Poe grew up hearing these stories in Irvine. And if that doesn't spark your imagination, if you're into Gothic writing, I don't know what does. So I maintain that a lot of his Gothic imagination came from that Ayrshire background, and he would have been brought up with Tam O'Shanter's great Gothic tale again.
Yeah. Well, actually, Tam O'Shanter's interesting, particularly with some of the things that we've spoken about, because there was no doubt that Scots was used for maybe certain colloquial, it was seen acceptable But then for more sentimental, the English was brought in. And in Tam O'Shanter, there's a chunk in the middle,
Yes.
but pleasures are like poppy spread, which is English.
You seize the flower as bloom is shed, or like the
Yeah.
snow falls in the river, a moment white and melts forever, or like the borealis trace that flit ere you can point their place, etc., etc. And it's absolutely beautiful. But it's a wee interlude. It's a wee holiday in the middle of the poem where he waxes lyrical and he shows off a bit in his beautiful English. But it's sunless. But time mun tether time nor tide, the hour approaches, tam mun ride. That hour o next black erch the key stain, that dreary hour he months his beast in, and sick and he tax the road in his near peer sinner was abroad in. So before it is solid Scots and after it is solid Scots, but it's just a wee display.
Do you think that's Burns showing he can do this?
I think so. And it's a wee interlude. And he's playing with conventions, those conventions you mentioned, of Scots being deemed appropriate in certain circumstances, but Augustan English being regarded as appropriate in other circumstances.
Well, I hope we can maybe get a reading from you in a moment, because subjects you touch upon include childhood games, but also songs, nursery rhymes, and sayings. And again, that's a place where I think Scots was deemed acceptable. Can you maybe give us a wee reading and we'll talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, this is there's a chapter called "A Saw for a Sere Leg," and a saw, apart from the English meaning of a saw, is the word for a proverbial expression, a Scots saw, and this is for that chapter. And I'll give you a couple of examples. What's for ye, I'll no go by ye. This is a dreich expression of Scots fatalism, that nae matter what ye do, nae matter who good ye are, nae matter who muckle you prepare to make sick or something bad doesn't happen, if you're fated to thole something and happening to ye, well, you just have to accept it and hold going. My mother used it, and when my Portuguese wife João heard her good mother say it, she speered naively if it could also refer to a good thing not going by you, Mummy Kay. Mammy Kay's repone was short into the pint. No. No, she said. An even more dowy example of this was, ye mun dree your weird. I was say into English, you must suffer your fate. And one more. You need a stout heart for a stye bray, or just a stout heart for a stye bray. You need a strong heart for a steep hill. This one was popular among the Kyle colliers, who often had to hout coal out of a narrow seam on a sere duke or a stye bray. Before the muckle industrial pits were sunk, and my grandfather was a skilly pit sinker by profession, there used to be a wee local mines that were accessible via an in-ganee, literally an in-going E, in English, an in-going I. An access tunnel that was dug out a field on the surface, and then there was a stye bray slope going down Forenoch to racks the coal seams to the surface. So these are an example of some of the sayings that were everyday sayings that I grew up with.
And I think it's an example of the oral tradition, because different areas would have slightly different versions of that. There's a few in there that went, oh yeah, 1, 2, 3 O'Leary, and the versions you have are slightly different to the ones I might have learned. So it's and of course that's how Scots language, of course, developed. Often was through spoken word rather than written word.
Yes, yeah, very. I mean, there's literally I've maybe got about 50 of these there, but I probably could have a wee more. It would just. I mean, and the other thing was, we're referring to literature. There was a lady came to visit my mum, Mrs. White, and they were having a conversation. It was all in Scots, and she would say, "Oh, Burns had a word for that," and she would launch into quoting Burns for the tap of her head.
Yeah.
So, as I say, Burns was a living tradition then, and the folklore, the songs, very powerful. The saws, the sayings, the literature, all were part of that background.
But again, you had in schools yearly Burns competitions where, yes, it's all right to use this language for this period of time, but then don't use it for the rest of the
That's
year.
right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
There's a saying which jumped out at me that you include, which is he'd drink it through a dirty clout. So he'd drink it through a dirty cloth to say he's so desperate for the drink that would happen. Now,
Aye.
there was
The,
legend in Glasgow, a pub called the Sarry Head, Saracen's
aye.
Head in the Barras, and they would have a thing, so it was claimed, called a ring of the rag. And that was at the end of the night, someone could pay 5p or whatever for the cloth that was soaking up all the dregs and ring it into a glass.
Oh,
And
that's
there's
great.
a ring of the rag.
That's great, dark Glasgow humour. Another like that, and a very totally different subject. I got this for Billy Jackson of Ossian, who is for an Irish background in Cambuslang, and he insists that among peer folk, and he probably was referring to Irish navvies coming over at that time in the 19th century, in the Paris Doss houses in Glasgow, you paid so much for a bed. If you couldn't afford a bed, you could have a tuppenny lean. And he insists that a rope was stretched and you would have folk leaning over draping themselves over the rope. And in the morning, the rope was cut down and they fell and woke up. I mean, for black humour, dark humour, you can't get better than that.
And, part of it, you think that could be true. For both of these things, that could be true.
Mm-hmm.
So, as we've mentioned, colloquial, song, various things which may be passed down, Scots was acceptable, but then perhaps it's not in literary and academic purposes, but that is changing. I wondered if you could say kind of when you saw this change happen.
Throughout my lifetime, I remember there was a poet who was all older than me called Willie Neal from Galloway, who wrote in Scots and who wrote in Gaelic. Very fine poet. And I remember overhearing a conversation. He was a mature student at Edinburgh University when I was there in my early 20s. I remember overhearing Willie saying to a group of people, if I was studying Indian philosophy and religion, people would regard me as cool and outgoing and admirable. But because I'm studying Celtic studies and Scottish literature, I'm regarded as a total eccentric. And that summed up the atmosphere to a certain extent of that period in the 1970s and 80s. Mm-hmm. At the same time, this brilliant course in Scottish literature was available 2 years at Edinburgh University. And within that, in the language department, a course on Scots and the history of Scots, taught by Jack Aiken. So it was strange that you could study it and it was respectable as something in the past, whereas to me, it was very much in the present and a living language and part of a national culture. So that, the cringe that affected people of my generation gradually gave way among younger people to realising their Scottish identity was their prime identity. They didn't have to translate themselves to go on in the world. And they grew confident in that identity. So it's been a gradual thing over the years. I mean, for example, on a Friday night there, a young woman called Taylor Dyson, who's the scriver at the National Library of Scotland, writes in Dundonian, the Dundonian dialect of Scots. And she has a regular session on every one Friday a month, where everybody gets up and does a turn, does a poem, and usually original material in Scots. That would have been unheard of 50 years ago when I was her age. But it's just an example of things developing. And I love to use traditional music and my Scots combined. And I've done a number of events with Robin Stapleton, who's one of the great Burns singers, one of the great contemporary Scots traditional singers. And I love to do readings which refer to some of the songs I grew up with, like Burns's "Oh, the It's the Wind Can Blow," or The Lass of Patie's Milk, which was an Alan Ramsey song from the part of Ayrshire I come from. And she comes in, I do the reading, then she comes in and illustrates them with a Scots song. And it's absolutely beautiful. And people just sit and absolutely love it. So that's an area that I think complements.
Yeah.
That's an interesting thing, that a lot of people were happy singing Scots songs in Broad Scots, but couldn't bring themselves to speak it because they were told it was ora, it was coarse, and they wouldn't get on in life, which is tragic.
No, I remember when James Kelmans, how late won the Booker Prize. And I get a copy going, oh, this is incredible. I was so excited by it. Not just language I knew, but places I knew and all of those things. And I gave a copy to my dad and he just couldn't read it. It just said, no, this is almost like illicit literature to me, you know? And I think generationally that was a strong feeling.
That's right. And interestingly, my dad loved Scots music, but he was used to the Kenneth MacKellar, almost sanitized version of it. And I remember giving him, through Hamish Henderson at the School of Scottish Studies, bought him a copy of Jeannie Robertson singing one of the great ballads. And he found her too coarse to listen to because he was used to a music hall and an operatic style of Scots song. Whereas today, the younger ones can have the quality of voice of Kenneth MacKellar and Bill McEwen, people like that, but they've got that soul in the language rooted in a culture and an identity which is different.
Yeah, there doesn't seem to be, I mean, you've mentioned the cringe a few times. I might be wrong about this, but it doesn't seem to be as prevalent as it was, definitely.
I would say so. I think it's dying a slow death.
When you studied Scottish literature, I'm interested, who were you studying? What were the books that you were studying?
It was the history going back to it's part of the Scots course as well, the Dream of the Rood and Barber, and then especially the Makars, Henryson and Dunbar, Gavin Douglas, Satire on Three Estates, Sir David Lindsay, who's just doing the road in Fife, and through to Vernacular Revival with Ferguson, Burns and Alan Ramsey, and through to Scott and Stevenson and into the 20th century. So it was really a history of Scottish literature, and I loved being exposed to it all. And I've continued to thoroughly enjoy that. I recently went back to Walter Scott and thoroughly enjoyed reading some of the Waverley novels, which I read back then and at that time.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand why it is, but I agree with you. I think Scott kind of gets a bad reputation, partly because of the length of a lot of them, but there's fantastic tales. The man could tell a story.
Oh, he's a great storyteller. And somebody like John Buchan, too, is a great storyteller. And I love his novels, too. And I would say it's interesting. Another change in Scottish society is that Buchan and Walter Scott were culturally, patriotically Scottish.
Yeah.
Buchan edited MacDiarmid and people like that in Scots. But politically, they were strongly pro-Britain and pro-Empire and pro-Union. Mm. But they were still patriotically and culturally Scottish. I think that type of person, I know very few people today who have that combination. In other words, the people who are against Scottish independence, with few exceptions, tend to be people who don't identify with the culture as well.
Yeah.
And it's a sad divide, that, because you could be politically different but still maintain a strong identity with Scottishness.
As with so many divisions today, I think the idea of nuance is kind of lost.
Yes.
That's the problem. It's so divided that you're either for us or against.
Yes.
It seems to me. Well, come back again to books that you studied and have read over the years, maybe Buchan being one of them, but kind of well known. Were there any that you felt have been overlooked, either writers or books, that are particular favourites of yours?
Well, I got through a lot of exams with the Sunset Song.
Yeah.
So I love Lose Grass. I got that as a prize when I was 16, in my fourth year at Galston High School before I went to Kilmarnock Academy. And literally, I started reading it over the summer, and I found the first 20 pages hard going, where he creates the kind of mythic background to Kinradi. And I wasn't sure how I'd go on with it. Then suddenly I was in there and I came out a different person. I came out, wow, this is my culture that and the bilingual thing that he describes Chris having was me. So that was an important one. But I always say that one of the most important books for me from an intellectual Scottish uh, background is George Davies' book, The Democratic Intellect.
Right.
And if you've never read that, to me, it should be a seminal text for anybody who's interested in Scottish cultural history.
Right.
It's ostensibly about Scottish universities and the attempt to anglicise them in the 19th century by various British government commissions. But in it, he goes into the whole background to that democratic intellectual tradition of Scotland having a broad-based education where you had to study science, language, etc., etc. You didn't specialise until much later on, and you sat hires, and had to sat 5 or 6 hires, compared to the English tradition of specialising very early on and studying 3 A levels. Broad-based intellectually, with philosophy often at its core, and broad-based culturally and societally, in that the kind of people who couldn't afford to go to university in England went to university in Scotland. So that is one of the greatest gifts of Scotland to the world. And we took that approach and to Africa, to Malawi, the great colleges in Nigeria and Malawi set up by Scottish missionaries had that democratic intellectual tradition at its core. And George Elder Davy, who was from the Hultoon in Dundee across the water from where I am just now, he wrote about that brilliantly in The Democratic Intellect. He also explored the humanist tradition of people who used Latin to express themselves, and Scots. Right. And they gave examples of great figures in Scottish cultural history who spoke Scots and wrote in Scots, and but also spoke Latin and wrote in that Latin tradition. And I had an amazing teacher at Kilmarnock Academy who embodied that, Mr. Malcolm, who'd been a high-up official in the British government during the colonial period in Sierra Leone. And he told us great stories from that. But he also had strong Scots. And when he was, for example, he translated Catullus's ode to his pet sparrow as his ode to his pet spug. And he translated it brilliantly. And he came away. We were in a 1960s annex of Kilmarnock Academy at that time. And he used to say things like, see that big pillar there, which is a rough cast pillar in the middle of the class. Right. All it's good for is for a big Ayrshire stirk to scart itself against. And you had the image of a big Ayrshire coo coming in and scarting and scratching itself against this pillar in the middle of the classroom. And he was a wonderful communicator. So that's an example of that humanist, Latin, and Scottish tradition, vernacular tradition, living side by side that I experienced in my own lifetime.
Yeah, all coming together. That's absolutely brilliant. And talking of literature, the book ends with a poem, Glencoe. Can you talk a bit about why you've included that in the poem itself?
It was when I was at Edinburgh University, there were 2 prizes that you could enter. One was the Sloan Prize, which was for writing in Scots. And I won that one year. And another was the Grierson Verse Prize. And I co-won that with Catherine Lucy Tchaikovsky, who went on to become a novelist. And the subject was Glencoe. That's what we were given, the subject matter. So what I did in it was compare and contrast a Wayne born in Glencoe at the time of the massacre and a Wayne born in the Milk Kai country of the Irvine Valley, the rich country of the Irvine Valley during the same period, and contrasted the life that they would have, and concluded about the sadness of Scotland, where we were better to our beast than to ourselves.
Yeah.
Your folk are dealing with their Scots souls, and you love and you plough your land, tend your beasts, loving nothing but yourselves. Just that sadness about the divides in Scottish society, but written back then in the 1970s.
Yeah, it's a wonderful poem. It's a perfect end to the book. Writing this book, how did you feel about looking back on your childhood? I'm guessing it was probably quite emotional to go back to those early days.
No, I found it cathartic.
Right.
I wanted to write it all down because I was aware that, especially in the language I was using, very few people would be writing in this way about it. And because I greatly valued the childhood I had and the love that I got and the confidence I got from that background, I just wanted to get it down on paper. Simple as that. As a statement, as a love letter to my Ayrshire childhood. And I mean, some people would look in that background and say it's parochial, it's small town, it didn't have much of a Weltanschauung, to use a good German word, a world perspective. But it did. And there's a story in there called The Last Game about the time of the missile crisis in Cuba, where me and my pals organised the last game of Pitba in case there was going to be a nuclear Armageddon. So we were aware of world affairs even there. And when people say you can't write about a wee place in Scotland and be universal, I think that's garbage.
Yeah.
One of the greatest writers that I studied at university was William Faulkner.
Mm-hmm.
And there is no place more backward and closed off to the world than rural and small town Mississippi in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, when Faulkner was creating his Yokna Petopa novels. But he creates something universal out of them. So you can be universal because ultimately it's the humanity that comes out of these places that he writes about and that I hope I write about in Born in Kyle.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you've got it's a story which starts in your childhood in small place, but actually then you take it out to the world. You go out to the world. You go to America, you go to Russia, you go to all these different places. And as you say, with the confidence of who you are, thrive and survive in these places.
Yes.
I can remember, it put me in mind, I was in Australia in the mid-90s and I stayed in this little hostel in Perth. And the guy who ran it was from Glasgow. And he'd been there for 35 years, I think, and his accent was as strong, if not stronger than mine. He would call me Haggis. All right, Haggis, how you doing every day? And just that kind of used to lift my heart as well. You know, you can move around, but you often take things with you. Another thing which stuck with me was I was at a conference in the south of Spain, and this American academic, we were sitting on the bus, and he said, there doesn't seem to be a Scottish diaspora. The Irish diaspora is everywhere, but there doesn't seem to be a Scottish one. And my answer was something along the lines of, well, there is, but we just don't like to crow about it. But, I mean, the perception's interesting, isn't it?
It is. And the Irish are much better, have been traditionally. We're getting better now with things like Tartan Week. The Irish traditionally were much better at blowing the trumpet than the Scots. But there's something more than that. The Irish have got a government behind them, and they realise the power of soft diplomacy.
Yeah.
I had a friend who had a radio programme on Celtic music on PBS, on the broadcasting service in the States. And she told me that when she had wanted some sponsorship for a special edition of the programme. She would phone the Irish embassy and they said, we'll come back to you in an hour and tell you if we can raise the money. And they came back and they always raised the money. She would do the same with the British embassy and they said, we'll get back to you. And they never did.
Yeah.
So there's also that going on.
Mm-hmm.
And some unionists might listen to this and it'll raise their hackles, but I'm afraid it's true. And that has profound cultural effects. For example, Witherspoon, one of the signatories of the Declaration of Independence in America, was president of Princeton College. He was a Church of Scotland minister who preached in Paisley and then went to Princeton, where he was one of the principals of Princeton College, which became Princeton University. Princeton and William and Mary and a number of the other colleges in the 18th century in America were built on Scottish democratic intellect traditions and the philosophy of the Scottish Enlightenment. Today in America, a place like Princeton, you can study Irish studies.
Yeah.
There was no intellectual tradition of Irish studies in early America when the university was founded. There was a strong Scottish tradition there. Scottish studies are not taught at Princeton University. Irish studies are. So again, it's because of the soft diplomacy and the backing of a government that realises the power of that,
yeah,
that you can have distortions, if you like, of history. And the Scottish effect on these universities can slow down so much that they can almost disappear. And that's tragic, because no place was more powerful at that time than the Scottish intellectual tradition. So again, that it's political, and it might not change without political change. But having said that, the Scottish government now has offices in Brussels. I've spoken there, in various places in Washington and various places in the world, where they realise that even with devolved power, they still can make a difference by communicating the culture around the world.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. And what's next for you, Billy? What are you up to at the moment?
Well, I've had some interesting things that I've written. I mean, I've translated Guy de Maupassant, one of his short stories, Vendetta, into Scots, for hopefully a forthcoming book. A number of people are translating his short stories from French into Scots. I've written a piece for a book about MacDiarmid. It's the 100th anniversary of the publication of A Drunk Man Looks at the Thistle, I think it is, next year. And so a number of writers like James Robertson are writing about that for a potential book as well. So I've written something on that. But my main outlet, it's hard getting books in Scots into bookshops. It really is. And where I tend mostly to promote the books is in front of an audience. And I've had the good fortune to do a lot of events, either solo, where you can overcome the prejudice against Scots, because when they hear it read, they can understand it fine.
Yeah.
And I enhance that with the singing of people like Robin Stapleton. So I'm doing gigs in Darvel and in Girvan at the Folk Festival in Girvan, and one in Inverness later on in the year. So they're wonderful. And I'm also reviving, I think I did back in the 80s, I think it was, Ferguson's Auld Reekie, the poetry of Robert Ferguson, and the music of Edinburgh in the 18th century. We did an album of that. I did it with great traditional singers, Rod Patterson, people like that, Derek Hoy, Norman Chalmers, Tony Cupp, who've all tragically passed away in the meantime. But we revived it last year for his 250th anniversary, and we performed it at Edinburgh University and with a sellout crowd. And we're reviving it and doing it in Portobello Town Hall in September, later on in the year. So these are great things. And I love nothing more than going to the rehearsals of these and hearing musicians like Uh, Sarah Hoy, Derek Hoy, who played in the original Daughter, plays the fiddle. Steve Byrne singing, and various great musicians who've taken part in it, including Karine Polwart. She was part of the revival last year. So that's been a great, great pleasure to do that.
Well, Billy, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. You've long been an inspiration for me in terms of getting the word out there about what's happening on our doorstep, what's happened in the past. And, there's some great stuff out there. So,
Absolutely.
only you can get it into people's hands. So, this has been an absolute privilege for me to talk to you.
Oh, a pleasure to talk to you too, Alistair. Thank you very much.
And we'll be back soon with someone completely different.